to the 2019 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series, hosted by University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems Small Farms team. My name is Grant McCarty. I'm one of the local food systems and small farms educators housed in Joe Davis, Stevenson, and Winnebago counties. We appreciate you joining us for these webinars. We will do our best to begin and end within the space of your lunch hour. This is a pretty tight time frame for our educators to deliver in-depth, actionable information. So please understand why we are limiting your questions to the text box at the left during the presentation. I will do my best to make sure our presenters answer them as time allows. So as you all know, this presentation will be recorded, and Zach will email a link to the archived presentation as soon as possible after this concludes. There will also be a link for a very short online evaluation of this presentation, and we very much appreciate your feedback for this. This week's presentation from Zach Grant, who you've heard from the last couple of weeks, and he is one of my fellow local foods and small farms extension educators stationed in Cook County. Zach has a BS in agribusiness horticulture from Illinois State University and a master's in horticulture from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. From 2008 to 2015, Zach was the manager and director of Sustainable Student Farm at the University of Illinois, a working small farm laboratory located on the fruit research farm at UIUC. The farm specialized in year-round vegetable production for campus while also conducting research, education, and outreach. From 2014 until today, the student farm has participated in the USDA GAP GHP audit program. In 2015, he became a local food systems and small farms educator for Cook County, focusing on urban food production systems programming for a diverse group of stakeholders. Zach is also one of Illinois' lead trainers for the Produce Safety Alliance's Produce Safety Ruling Training for the Food Safety Modernization Act. And with that, take it away, Zach.
All right. Thanks a lot, Grant, for the great introduction. And it's great to be here with everyone today, not as a moderator, but as a presenter. So as Grant alluded to, part of my work at the statewide level is to conduct food safety training related to the Food Safety Modernization Act. And we do this in collaboration with Cornell University and the Produce Safety Alliance. So the Produce Safety Alliance with Cornell has a cooperative agreement with the FDA to disseminate training around the produce safety rule in particular. And there are a few other cooperative agreements throughout the United States, but this is the main one. This is the main grower training that we're asking all produce growers to participate in to be in compliance with at least part of the rule for FSMA. So I'll show you some resources for the Produce Safety Alliance and where you can look to for future trainings that we actually conduct. So this presentation today is going to solely focus on FSMA produce safety rule exemptions and some guidance surrounding that. When we do the full day trainings for the produce safety rule with PSA, we often don't spend a lot of time talking about who legally has to comply with the federal rule and what these exemptions actually involve and who can actually get them. We do cover it, but we don't spend a great amount of time. So this slide set was actually developed by the Produce Safety Alliance to kind of address those particular concerns. And then I also threw in a few of my own slides to talk a little bit about questions we often get surrounding hydroponics, aquaponic operations, sort of non-soil-based operations. And what we're going to do is kind of go over the exemptions, what they mean, what they look like, and some definitions. And then we'll go through a variety of scenarios and quizzes to kind of get you aligned with, potentially what your operation is and if you have to comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then we'll look at some recent FDA announcements and updates and a few other sort of 2019 pertinent things. So 2019 marks the first year that inspections by FDA auditors, or if you're in a state that has a cooperative agreement with the FDA, potential state Department of Ag inspector could come to a produce operation and see if a farm is in compliance with the produce safety rule. So this won't apply to all farms. This will likely start off with very, very large farms, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit throughout the presentation. But the produce safety rule is here and it's actively being enforced. So I think it's important to highlight the exemptions and highlight guidance and things that you need to know as a farm moving forward. So we'll go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't know what the Food Safety Modernization Act, this was actually passed into law on January 4th of 2011 by President Obama. It was actually the most sweeping reform of U.S. food safety laws in over 70 years. And in fact, produce farms had never been subjected to federal regulation of any kind. And the produce safety rule is only one part of 7 parts of the Food Safety Modernization Act. So our training, my expertise, and guidance in this webinar today is only really focused on produce safety rule. And it kind of lightly overlaps a little bit with preventative controls rule for human food. The PC rule is what we call that, but there's a completely separate alliance that deals with that, and that's actually more for food manufacturing, food processing, and in particular for larger operations. People often have the question of, does preventative controls at the federal level overlap with the Illinois Cottage Food Law that we had a webinar about a few weeks ago? And my current understanding that it does not. Cottage food operations would not be considered facilities and therefore not regulated at the federal level under the PC rule. But there are some larger farms that are called mixed type facilities that would potentially have to overlap with both produce safety rule and preventative controls rule. And you'll see that in a little bit. And in fact, that flow chart that I sent in the email to everyone kind of elucidates that distinction a little bit more clearly. But this training and my expertise in this webinar is mainly revolving around the produce safety rule. And again, this is all focused on prevention. This is not, meant to kind of force farmers into farming in a sterile environment. This is all about risk mitigation, not elimination. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. And additionally, I, as an extension agent, have a very neutral position about this. I don't want to get into any sweeping debate about, federal overreach in terms of, what this rule actually means. So we can have that conversation at a different time if you have questions related to that. But the produce safety rule is here, and I just want to make everyone, make sure everyone is on the same page so they know if they have to comply or not. So when we do the full day training, we cover all these critical control points or potential contamination sources. In fact, there's 7 modules, and we cover 6 of them in depth here with all of these, or 5 of them. Human health and hygiene, soil amendments, wildlife and animal intrusion, water is a big section, and then obviously post-harvest and equipment handling. So we're not going to dive into the details of that. That is what the full day training is for. And if you are interested in the full day training, the next slide will show you the Produce Safety Alliance website where you can go to learn about some of our upcoming trainings. And we do have a few of them coming up both this spring and then again in the fall for those of you who need to take the training or want to take the training. So we will talk a little bit about water a little bit later on, but again, this webinar is not meant to go into depth in any of these particular areas. That's what the full day training is for. So here is just a quick screenshot of what the Produce Safety Alliance website looks like. So in any search engine, just go ahead and type in Produce Safety Alliance, Cornell, and you will find this website. And this is probably the best catch-all resource for information surrounding the produce safety rule as part of FSMA. So here you can find where the trainings are. There's a list of trainings throughout the entire United States, as well as other resources, news, updates related to this. So if you want to find out where the newest information is, you can always contact me. But, this is a direct go-to source. There's even a great listserv and newsletter and monthly call sign-in sheet that you can get on so you can stay up to date with the latest and greatest when it comes to the produce safety rule. So I just wanted to show everyone that so you know where to go to look for our full trainings if you're interested in signing up for one of those. Okay, so with that, we're going to just jump right in to the material. So the big question that people have surrounding the produce safety rule part of FSMA is my farm exempt or am I excluded from the federal legislation? Okay, and that's an important distinction, the federal legislation, because at the state level or the private buyer level, there may be some other things you want to adhere to, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But with FSMA in particular, there are some exclusions and exemptions. So growers may be excluded based on if they're growing the type of commodity they're growing. If it's considered a rarely consumed raw item by the FDA, then that would exclude you if you're exclusively growing that, and we'll see that in a second. The average annual produce sales so the size of your business, that's an important distinction that we'll elucidate in a little bit. Personal on-farm consumption. So there was a lot of fear surrounding FSMA when this was first being discussed and legislated, that the federal government was coming in and preventing you from growing your own produce on your own property. That's absolutely not true. And so personal on-farm consumption, FSMA has nothing to do with that at all. You can do whatever you want in terms of growing food if you're eating it yourself, or with your keeping it kind of within your family. Now, some growers may also be exempt based on processing activities or commercial processing after they're one step forward to the buyer that they're selling it to, and we'll discuss that in a little detail. And then the one thing that everyone wants to know about is the qualified exemption based on average annual food sales to qualified end users. And we're going to discuss that in great detail, because that's the real crux of what people want to understand is, can I have a qualified exemption to the produce safety rule? And hopefully you'll understand that by the end of this webinar. But ultimately, I want to point out that all growers should understand and take action to reduce food safety risk on the farm. So this is my soapbox, sort of Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires moment. So even if you're exempt from this rule, I encourage you to have some level of food safety planning or food safety systems built into your operation, and understand some of these basic concepts so you can prevent foodborne illness outbreaks and getting people sick, frankly. So we encourage you to take our training that we do in collaboration with the Produce Safety Alliance. Yes, it costs money, but some of them moving forward are going to be more expensive than others. In fact, we have a couple subsidized trainings coming up from some outside funding. So we encourage everyone to take it. You learn basic good agricultural practices, as well as how that ties into the actual federal legislation itself. Okay. So, this slide is just kind of showing you within the Federal Register, the different parts of the register. You can, go to the food safety website, or I'm sorry, the Produce Safety Alliance website, and look at the actual Federal Register. The unique thing about this training we do with the Produce Safety Alliance is that it ties, the good ag practices that we've done in older food safety trainings, but this ties it directly to the federal legislation. So we have, tables and charts and the actual letter of the law, if you will, in the binders for the training, and it cross-references it. So every time we come to a section of, some sort of practice that you should be doing or you must be doing, it ties it directly to the federal legislation in the binder. So it's kind of unique in that sense, and that's what really separates it from other food safety trainings you may have taken, or with us or with other organizations in the past. So let's talk about the exclusions based on average annual produce sales and the produce definition that's within the produce safety rule. So the basic sort of low cutoff for farms is the $25,000 previous 3-year rolling average. So of course, this is adjusted for inflation. So if you look in 2018 with the 3-year rolling average inflation adjusted, that would be closer to $27,000 in 2018. So as it stands in 2019, it'll go up a little bit. But for 2018, if you are selling less than $27,000 worth of produce, or $26,999, then the produce safety rule does not apply to your operation. Okay, so that's the first level of exemption you might be able to qualify for. And in terms of produce, what they actually mean, it's written here. So any fruit or vegetable, including mixes of intact fruits and vegetables, includes mushrooms, sprouts, irrespective of seed source, peanuts, tree nuts, and herbs. And I'll mention sprouts in a little bit, but sprouts is actually, there's another level of complication with sprouts, because there's a higher risk level with sprouts, at least as the FDA sees it. And there's a few other things you need to know about that. We're not going to cover that today, and that's in fact a completely separate training. But it is important to distinguish, I guess I'll do it here, the difference between sprouts and microgreens. For any of us on the call who are doing commercial microgreen production, the FDA does recognize the difference between sprouts and microgreens, but they do consider microgreens produce or a vegetable, if you will, and it has to comply with all the other parts of the produce safety rule. So covered produce is another definition. Again, the fruits and vegetable produce definition from the previous slide. So you might hear this term RAC, or raw agricultural commodity. So this includes both domestically and imported product. Obviously, most of us in the small farm world, we're mainly thinking about domestically, and in fact, very locally and regionally. Is what we're talking about with covered produce. Now, embedded within this, they actually have somewhat of an exhaustive list of what the FDA considers to be rarely consumed raw produce. So if you're growing, if your entire business operation revolves around one of these 34 items or a combination of these 34 items, then if you're exclusively growing these things and that's it, then you actually would have an exclusion or exemption from the produce safety rule, because the FDA considers this not covered produce because they consider it rarely consumed raw. Now, we could have a debate about this. There are some things that cross over a little bit, which is strange. Things like garden beets, which I understand. And they consider both roots and tops, which some people do eat garden beets raw. They are mainly cooked primarily before they're consumed, but some people do consume them raw. You can make the same argument with sweet corn and maybe a few other things on this list. But at least from the FDA's perspective, this is a rarely exhaustive list of things that they consider rarely consumed raw and therefore aren't covered produce with the definition from the previous slide, and your farm wouldn't have to adhere to the produce safety rule. Now, that being said, if you are growing some of these items, right? So, for instance, a produce farmer very likely could be growing winter squash, eggplants, garden beets, sweet corn, but in all likelihood, you are growing a number of other produce items that are covered under the produce safety rule. So, if your systems are all intermingled and you don't have a way to separate the production of those things in your systems from probably seed all the way to post-harvest storing and shipment, then that's going to be difficult for you to justify that. But it's just important to understand this rarely consumed raw list because it does exist. So again, we covered the personal on-farm exclusion or exemption. So anything that you're growing for personal use or for your family on the farm or another farm under the same management is not covered. So if you're eating this yourself for your own personal family household consumption, then it's not covered under the produce safety rule. So the other distinction here that we need to talk about is the rarely consumed the raw agricultural commodities or RACs that we just defined a moment ago from non-RACs. So PSR, this particular produce safety rule that we're discussing here, does not cover things like sliced apples, cut green beans that are frozen or other processed items. Those things, if you are defined as a facility and you're doing larger scale commercial processing, that would be covered under the preventative controls rule for human food and not under the produce safety rule. So it's an important distinction between RACs and things that are not raw agricultural commodities. So there's also covered activities during harvest. So this is something that these are things that won't trigger the facility definition that the FDA has and would be considered as part of the primary production farm definition. So these are things you can actually do that wouldn't trigger the facility definition, and therefore you'd have to adhere with the preventative controls rule. So this keeps you within the produce safety rule, in other words. So things like, washing, the actual harvesting act, trimming outer leaves, shelling, a variety of things and activities that are affiliated with the actual harvest. And then there will be some things post-harvest as well. So if you're concerned about whether, washing or packing makes you a facility rather than a farm, it doesn't. Those are actually covered activities, and you would still be considered a farm and not an actual facility. So there are a few other processes that would actually also be considered covered activities under a primary production farm and not trigger the facility definition. So some of these, they consider these sort of low risk manufacturing or food processing. So things like dehydrating or drying, treating for ripening. Okay, so this is the case for larger tomato growers who might be ethylene ripening green tomatoes into red tomatoes for shipment, and then packaging and labeling. So these activities you're still considered a farm, and it doesn't trigger the facilities definition, okay? So there's both harvesting activities and then even some processing activities outlined here that still make you fall under the farm definition and will not trigger you to become a facility, which is the preventive controls rule, and it's a whole different ball game if you have to adhere to that other part of FSMA. So it's an important distinction to make. So commercial processing is another exemption that you may actually have, okay? So this would be the case. So the best example I can think of is if you are a large tomato processor or sauce tomato grower that sells directly to a processor that would, convert that into something like ketchup or canned tomatoes. Okay. So if you are solely doing that and you have that specific documentation trail and written assurances between you and the buyer of your item that's going to process that material, right? So validated canning processes or other validated kill step processes, if you have that written assurance and documentation from your buyer, then, and that's all you do, that's all you're selling and growing, then you would have an exemption via this commercial processing portion of the PSR. Okay, so that's an important distinction to make. Now, if you're doing this, but you're still selling other raw agricultural commodities that aren't being processed, then this would still apply. This would only apply if this is all you're doing. So the best example I can think of is if you're a sauce tomato grower and that's all you do. Okay, but again, there's still specific documentation and written assurances that you must have in place in order for this exemption to actually apply. Now we get to the real interest with the exemptions, and this is the qualified exemption and qualified end user definition. For those of you who have been following the legislation, this was also known as the Tester Amendment. So John Tester and another member of Congress actually submitted this as an amendment to protect, essentially smaller farmers. So kind of the audience that we have here with the webinar series. So this is what we really need to have you understand what the qualified exemption means, what qualified end users are, in order to see if your operation actually falls under that. And it on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, but there is nuance with this. And as we go through this quiz, a series of quizzes here in a second, you will see some of this nuance. And in my mind, this is at a bare minimum a reason why you should at least take the training with us to understand all of these different potential contamination pathways a little bit better, because you may think that you have a qualified exemption right now as it currently stands, but you might see how either as your farm expands or through kind of a technicality with these definitions, you may actually have to be in compliance with PSR. So let's go over this in a kind of a slow, stepwise fashion so you really understand this. So for the qualified exemption, the first thing that you have to have compliance with is that during the previous 3-year period, okay, more than half of the average annual monetary value of the food, okay, then that's important to know. So this is not just produce. This is if you are selling meat, if you are selling grain, if you are selling jams, pickled products, any popcorn in an agribusiness setting, that qualifies as food. Okay, it's not just produce. I know this is contentious, and there's probably we get lots of questions and frustrations with this. But as it's currently written, the FDA has it set up so this is food, all food, not just produce. So let me step back. More than half of the average annual monetary value of all the food the farm sold was directly to qualified end users, and we'll define that in a second. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and define it right away. So the qualified end user is either the consumer of the food, and the consumer does not include a business, or a restaurant or retail establishment that is located in the same state or same Indian reservation as the farm that produced the food, or not more than 275 miles from such farm. So some of the things that fit under both a consumer of food and the retail food establishment would be things like roadside farm stands, meal kit services if you were selling to a meal kit service, grocery stores, convenience stores, farmers markets, as well as a consumer of food would be a CSA participant as well, or some other subscription service. So it's you as the farmer directly selling food to the end user. There cannot be any middle person between you and the end product. So if you're selling directly to a grocery store that sells it to an end user, that's fine. But if you're selling it to a produce broker or some sort of distributor, and then they turn around and sell that to a grocery store, then that would not qualify as a qualified end user. Okay, so that's the first thing that you have to adhere to. The second part is that the average annual value of all the food, remember, not just the produce, all food on the farm sold during the 3-year period, so this is an average, the 3-year rolling average, was less than $500,000. Okay, so this is also adjusted for inflation, and if you took the 3-year inflation for 2018, it would actually be significantly higher, around $539,000. So if 50% or more of your food is to the qualified end user, and you aren't selling more than $539,000 in 2018, then you can have qualified exemption. Okay, that doesn't mean that you're completely off the hook. We'll look at a couple things in a little bit. But one of the things it absolutely means is that in order to establish this qualified exemption, if the FDA or your state regulator wanted to know this, you have to keep records of your food sales. So I know that seems like duh, right? We are keeping track of as a business, we are keeping track of our food sales, but it's important to understand that it's not just produce, it's all food for your operation, and you need to keep track of those sales and have records of those sales to be able to prove that you are under this $539,000 threshold. Okay, so that's important. That's the first record that you have to have, even if you are going to be qualified exempt. So let's go over a scenario that was actually submitted to the FDA's TAN, which is, or although it's called the Technical Assistance Network. So those of us doing produce safety training, or just, citizens, can submit questions about the produce safety rule to the FDA TAN. And this is a question that was submitted that I flagged because I thought it was quite interesting and might be, analogous to some of your situations out there. So let's go over this a little bit. And figure out this scenario. So it's a produce grower who sells more than $25,000 over the 3-year average. Okay, so that would be adjusted for inflation in 2018, $26,999, but less than $500,000. Okay, $539 for inflation adjusted in all food over that 3-year average. And in this case, this grower just is producing vegetables. They're not selling any other value added or grains or meats or anything like that. The grower also sells within the same state and within 275 miles of where the produce is grown. Okay, so it's sounding good so far, right? 40% of this grower sales are through local farmers markets, so the direct end user definition, right? 60% of the total food sales go through a local food hub. This local food hub is also within 275 miles of the same state as where the produce is grown. This particular food hub is an aggregator of raw agricultural commodities and does not conduct any processing activities. The hub handles many other farms' produce from the region and distributes to further markets, many of which are not direct consumers. In this scenario, would the food hub be considered a qualified end user or not? And would this grower satisfy for the requirements of the qualified exemption that we just discussed? So if you want to go ahead and put that in the chat box, you can, because I'm going to ask you to do that for a few other quizzes we're going to have here in a second. So does this grower satisfy the requirements for the qualified exemption as I've just explained it to you in the previous slide? So I'll just give you a couple seconds and then we'll skip to the next slide if you think that this applies. So just a couple seconds and then I'm going to move on to the next slide if no one answers. So Don says no, 60% is not sold to the end user, okay? Vanessa says no. They're both right. So according to the FDA, in response to this particular situation, they're saying that the food hub does not meet the definition of a qualified end user. Therefore, a grower's farm is not eligible for the qualified exemption because 60% of the sales were to this non-qualified end user. Now, they recognize that some food hubs have different business models, like that operate more like a grocery store, right? Or even a restaurant. But in this case, the way that this grower was describing the food hub, this sounds like distributing to further markets. This sounds like a middle distributor or a produce broker. So therefore, they would not qualify as either a retail food establishment or an end user. So I wanted just to kind of point this out because I think, this scenario probably isn't too far off for a lot of us on the call, right? I mean, I know a lot of farms who are probably under that $500,000 threshold, but are, looking to do a little bit more wholesaling and maybe even sell through food hubs and some of these other cooperative agreements. So you have to make sure that you are selling directly to a qualified end user, or who you're selling to is selling to a qualified end user, or is that qualified end user. So I know there's a lot of nuance here, and maybe even this is making it more confusing for some of you, but it's just important to kind of really understand the definition of the qualified end user and the qualified exemption. So what we'll do, we have 4 or 5 questions here, and this will maybe kind of help make it a little bit simpler for everyone on the call. And go ahead in the chat box, go ahead and type in, yes, no, or you're not sure. A, B, or C, you can put it in there, and then we'll kind of discuss each question. So the first quiz will be: a farm sells $19,000 in produce average over a 3-year period at a local farmer's market and through a CSA. Is this farm covered by the produce safety rule part of FSMA? So most of you are chiming in no, no, B, no, no, no. You're absolutely correct. In this case, no, you would not be covered because it's less than $25,000 or $26,999 inflation adjusted. So in this scenario, if this describes your farm, then you would not be covered under the produce safety rule. Excellent. So quiz number 2. A farm sells $35,600 in produce and also sells $650,000 in other food products, including sauerkraut and jam, on a 3-year rolling average. Do they satisfy the qualified exemption requirements as described previously? Okay, a couple people said no. So we're getting a lot of no's, All right, we're 2 for 2. No, this would not qualify because since the farm is more than $25,000 in average annual produce, they would not be covered, and they also do not qualify for the qualified exemption since they sell over $500,000 in other food products. So this is where it kind of starts to get tricky, and I know that a lot of a lot of agritourism operations might fit under this sort of definition, where they might sell a small amount of actual raw agricultural commodity, but they do a lot of other food value-added sales for their agritourism operation. So this would probably describe a situation like that. And in this case, that farm would not satisfy the qualified exemption. So quiz number 3. A farm sells $475,000 in produce on a 3-year rolling average. $200,000 of that is to wholesale or out of state, more than 275 miles, $200,000 to a local restaurant, and $75,000 to a local grocery store. Do they satisfy requirements for a qualified exemption in this scenario? So we'll just wait a couple seconds, see if we can get some answers in the chat box. Okay, we've got some no's. 1 yes. So we've got some differing opinions on this one. Let's see what the answer is. The answer is yes. They do. They likely will be eligible for a qualified exemption because the sales to the qualified end users, so the local restaurant and grocery store, exceed the wholesale sales of $200,000 to the wholesaler out of state, and all sales are less than that $500,000 rolling average. So in this case, this situation, this farm would have the qualified exemption. Okay, hopefully this is becoming a little bit clearer. So we'll do one more, and then we'll do a final exam at the very end here. A farm sells all of their $28,000 in produce annually to a distributor located more than 275 miles away and not in the same state of where the produce is grown. The farm grows potatoes, pumpkins, sweet corn, winter squash, and has 1 acre of raspberries and strawberries. Is this farm covered by the produce safety rule? Yes, no, or I'm not sure. What do you all think? Okay, so we got 1 no, they're not covered by the produce safety rule. Yes, they are covered. No, they're not covered. So again, a little bit more confusion. So in this scenario, and we could ask a few questions from this particular quiz question. in this scenario, this farm would be covered. Yes, because raspberries and strawberries are covered produce, and the total produce grown is above $25,000. And total produce includes, with the strawberries and raspberries, I'm sorry, it includes rarely consumed raw commodities. Okay, so do they satisfy the qualified exemption? No, because they grow less than $500,000 in food, but they're selling all of their produce, more than 50% of the total, to a distributor that's out of state or more than 275 miles from where the produce is grown. This does not make this buyer a qualified end user, and therefore this farm would not satisfy the qualified exemption. But you could ask the question, what if they sold all this produce within the 275 miles from where the produce was grown? Would they satisfy the qualified exemption then? And I think the answer to that would be maybe. It would depend on if over half of their sales were to buyers that fit the qualified end user description, and they are under the $500,000, so part of it's required, but that qualified end user is an important piece. So this just illustrates why it's not quite as straightforward. The two requirements that we highlighted a few slides ago are pretty straightforward, but you really need to analyze your total sales, your end users, and where you're selling this product to really figure out if your operation falls under this qualified exemption. Okay. So I mentioned already that if you do have a qualified exemption, that you have to keep records to be able to prove that. But there are a couple other things that you have to adhere to, and these are what they call the modified requirements if for a qualified exemption. So if you have a qualified exemption, you still must follow a couple things, and these are important for traceability. So if you are doing any sort of food packaging or food packaging is required, so I guess the best example I can think of for that is if you're selling your herbs or your salad greens, your head lettuce in clamshells, for instance. Under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act at the federal level, you technically have to label those items. You have to label what it is, what it weighs, and a description of the product. And on that, you would also have to include the name and complete business address of where the produce was grown. So in that scenario, you still have to, label if you have to label your product, you have to let people know who you are and how they can get a hold of you. Now, if you're not labeling any product, like in the case of if you're not doing anything like I described in that scenario and you're just selling racks at a farmer's market, right? Then you have to display at the point of sale the name and complete business address of where the produce was grown. Okay. So, and then if you are selling via CSAs, for instance, then you would have a direct link to your end users. So they should know how to get a hold of you anyway. So there has to be some connection between you and the end user in terms of how they can get a hold of you, even if you have this qualified exemption to the produce safety rule. Okay. So this will be the final exam question before we get into a few other things to finish the presentation off. Okay, so a grower is eligible for the qualified exemption and is only subject to modified FSMA requirements like we just described in the last slide. However, their end user buyer, requires a food safety audit in order to accept them as a supplier. Does this grower need to comply with these buyer's requirements? What's the answer to this? Is it yes, no, or you don't know? Go ahead and answer. Okay, so some people are saying yes. Some people are, so we've got a couple yeses. And the answer to this question is absolutely yes. So if you want to, so audits are not required by the regulation, but they're required by some buyers or end users. So if you want to sell to certain grocery stores, or maybe even certain restaurants, they might actually require you to go through third-party food safety verification. Okay, so what is that? So you might have heard of gap audits or different types of audits from, the USDA AMS service, Primus, SQF. There's a lot of third-party independent food safety audit programs out there. And the best analogy I can make to this would be very similar to organic certification. Organic certification is not required, but if you want to be able to market your products as certified organic, right? And there's even a certain monetary threshold. If it's more than $5,000 in produce, then you have to have independent third-party verification that you're following these practices. The same thing happens in the produce safety world. So some end users may require third-party audits like GAP, or Primus or SQF. There's a few of them out there. So this is voluntary. This is completely industry driven. FSMA and the FDA is federally mandated law. So there's a difference between the two. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is if you're interested in participating and your buyer requires third-party verification, a lot of these audit services are now aligning their audit checklists with the produce safety rule. So 2 birds with 1 stone, essentially. And a good example of that would be the USDA's Harmonized GAP program. Their checklists for that third-party independent audit service is also in alignment with the produce safety rule part of FSMA. So if you're doing that audit, then you should also be in compliance with the produce safety rule, and all those records and documents that you have for that plan should help you if an FDA inspector were to ever come to your operation. Okay. So I just wanted to recap, there are exclusions and exemptions based on types of commodities, how much you're selling, and where you're selling it to. The definition and your sales are really, some of those definitions, you need to really understand those to figure out if you're going to be compliant with PSR or not. And I hope that this kind of helped clarify that a little bit more. Now, what I want to do for the rest of the presentation, we have about 20 minutes left, is just to kind of highlight some updates and some other questions that we've had out there regarding, certain parts of PSR or FDA updates. These next 2 slides deal with aquaponic and hydroponic operations. We get this question all the time, particularly with my urban agriculture stakeholders who participate in aquaponic and hydroponic operations, is how do these operations fit in with the produce safety rule part of FSMA? Now, there isn't anything explicit about these types of systems in the rule itself, but in the preamble to FSMA, the FDA went through a commenting period where people submitted these questions and they submitted their responses. So I kind of dove through that a little bit and pulled out some of these salient points. So the FDA does recognize that the growing environments between hydroponics and aquaponics differ from soil-based systems. However, these systems are not exempt from the produce safety rule. So most of those routes of contamination that we looked at in one of the earlier slides still apply to these operations. So yes, there is no soil in these systems, but the worker health and hygiene still applies. The water rules still apply. The equipment cleaning and sanitation still apply. So most of those routes still apply. Okay, so that's important to distinguish. So one other comment that was thrown out there was that, fish don't normally carry E. coli, salmonella, some of these foodborne pathogens we're concerned about. And that is true in general, but if there is E. coli contamination at high enough levels in water, then fish could potentially become carriers via different routes of contamination, like the feed in an aquaponic operation, water, or sediment that needs to be filtered out of those particular operations. And they also mentioned that fish carry other potential human health pathogens like Vibrio speciosa that could, but there isn't a lot of data, or they're not throwing a lot of data out there, but this is what the FDA recognized in their comments to these questions, okay? The other interesting thing is that the USDA GAP, third-party volunteer GAP auditing service, they're starting to certify aquaponic and hydroponic operations. And this is just kind of an overview of some of the guidelines for their pilot program, looking at aquaponic operations in particular, where they're requiring a physical separation between the fish aquaculture and the crop hydroponic area. They recommend filtration to get out sediments, and also are recommending treating the water as it's being recirculated through the system. And they provide a number of different options or examples like UV treatment, chlorine, ozone. There's a lot of different options out there, and they want you to have SOPs in place for tools, equipment, employees, water, protective clothing, and things like that. So all that being said, aquaponic, hydroponic operations, this doesn't get you out of the water, either for the federal FSMA PSR rule or for these third-party GAP audits, because there are, large industry within aquaponics and hydroponics are starting to participate in these programs. So I just wanted to point that out. So a few other announcements that are relevant to 2019 in particular, I want to cover these really quickly. So there's 2 draft guidance documents for produce growers that might be relevant to you that the FDA has recently put out. So these were published in the Federal Register in the fall of 2018, and you can actually, go and look at these things and submit comments to the FDA until April 22nd of this year. So the first one that applies to produce growers is the standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. So what a guidance document is the FDA, who is enforcing the rules for PSR, it's their interpretation of the law. So it should follow, everything that we cover when we do the big training and everything I've said today, but they might provide a little bit more guidance and a little bit more specific information that might help you in your operation. So I encourage you, if you're interested in that, to go, any search engine and type in standards for growing, harvesting, packing, holding produce, FDA. You'll find it, read through it, and you can even submit comments. The second guide to minimizing food safety hazards of fresh cut produce actually applies more to mixed type facilities or farms that may be doing some processing that isn't covered, that we didn't discuss in the previous slide. So this would be for facilities that are doing more processing. They have a guidance document out for that as well that you can also look over and submit comments as well. You'll notice when you look at this, the first guidance document that I'm discussing, the egg water, one of the critical control points, the contamination routes, is not included in this guidance document, and you'll see why in a second. And this is because of all the parts of the produce safety rule, everything is officially law and being enforced right now, except for the water portion of the rule. And back in September of 2017, the FDA submitted a potential extension for water compliance. And that's because the water rule surrounding the produce safety rule is a little complicated, and they want to give growers a little bit more time and the FDA a little bit more time to figure out how they're going to enforce this and provide better guidance for growers when it comes to water sampling and things like that. Okay. So I or the Produce Safety Alliance we haven't officially heard that this is actually law, but this is a press release from September of 2017. So farms that will be inspected this year, they'll be inspected, and enforcement will take place for all parts of the produce safety rule with the exception of water compliance. There's a bit of an extension with water compliance. And what that looks like is this. So if you are a very small business, so above that 25K threshold, but up to $250,000, then the original compliance date for your farm would be January of next year. Okay. And then in the first rule, you would have had 2 additional years, the way it was first written, to come in compliance with the water rule. But now they've extended that to an additional 2 years. So you actually won't have to come into compliance with subpart E, the water portion of the rule, until 2024. So, and as you go up, depending on the size of your compliant business with the PSR, those are the dates. So right now, this year and last year, starting in 2018, all of the very large farms and some of the medium-sized farms have to be compliant with PSR except for water. Okay. And everyone has some level of extension, as you can see here, with compliance for the water portion of it. So what does this mean in terms of collecting water sampling? And this can get very, very nuanced, and I'm just going to breeze over this quickly because there's a lot of confusion with this. Does this mean that you need to have your water compliance by the time 2022 rolls around, for instance, for the very large farms? No. What we think it means is that you don't have to technically start testing your water and developing what we call a microbial water quality profile for your production water and your post-harvest water until that compliance date. So this slide just kind of illustrates a flow chart of how you might approach that, because we would encourage growers to start sampling their water sources now with one of these equivalent testing methods we'll cover here in a second. You don't technically need to until your compliance date for your size farm, but we'd encourage you to start getting familiar with water testing now and developing some part of your water quality profile, so when your compliance date does roll around, you have those records for an inspector if they were to come to your operation. Okay? So again, there is extension with the water portion of the rule, but you should continue testing water if you're doing it. And if you haven't started doing it, we would encourage you to do it. Okay. Now, for egg water or the production water, so things for like irrigation, crop sprays, that type of water testing has to be a quantitative form of testing. So it can't be pass-fail or qualitative testing like you do for your home well, for instance, like for fecal coliforms. Those are usually pass or fail. And for the production water, you actually have to quantify how much generic E. coli you have in your water. That's the standard that they're using for the PSR rule, is quantitative generic E. coli. So, reach out to a lab you're working with. We have some labs we can recommend, and begin doing your water testing as soon as possible for your operation. So one of the things that they updated last year too were these water testing equivalent methodologies. So they do recognize present, absence, or pass-fail methods for post-harvest water. So this is water that we're using after harvest for washing produce, for instance, or washing our hands, or cleaning and sanitizing our tables. This water has a strict requirement, and they want 0 generic E. coli in that particular water. So if you are testing that type of water for generic E. coli, you can do pass-fail for that type of test, because you have to have 0 generic E. coli anyway. But for the production water, you can actually have a certain level of generic E. coli in your water, and they want you to quantify that. So for your irrigation water, crop sprays, things like that, you actually want to do a different test for that. And they have a number of equivalencies to the original method that they published in the rule. And the original methodology was this modified MTEC, this top one you see. It's called EPA method 1603. They do recognize a number of other methods that they cite here, so you would need to contact your lab and make sure that they follow at least one of these equivalent methods. Now, the frustrating part with this is that the quantitative methodology actually requires you, according to the modified MTEC or method 1603, to take a water sample and get it to the lab within 6 hours. So this is frustrating, because if you aren't close to a lab, or you don't have the ability to get your sample to a lab within 6 hours, that actually would violate the chain of custody, and that would technically not be a certifiable analysis of generic E. coli. So this is something we're hoping the FDA gives us more guidance on, and maybe part of the reason why they've extended this guideline out 4 years. With the quantitative testing, pass-fail testing, you can actually submit the sample to the lab within 30 hours. So overnight shipping of a quantitative water sample would be okay. So again, it is confusing. I recommend checking out first of all, I recommend taking the training with us, and we'll cover this in greater detail with our all-day training. But also, you can visit the Produce Safety Alliance's website, and you can understand this a little bit more. They have some guidance documents on here. In fact, all these equivalent methodologies, they have a good reference sheet on the Produce Safety Alliance website for you to look at. So when you contact your lab that you're going to use, you can identify the proper testing that you need for water testing. So the last thing I want to briefly discuss is enforcement discretion. So this is important because routine inspections are beginning this spring for the very, very large operations. There'll be no enforcement of subpart E, which is the water part that we just went over in brief, other than for sprouts. I mentioned earlier that sprouts actually has a stricter water quality test or water quality standard. And in fact, all the water for a true sprouting operation has to have generic E. coli for the production or for post-harvest. There can be no generic E. coli in the water. And they also have a few other more stringent tests that they actually want you to go through if you're growing sprouts. Now, again, remember I said they recognize that microgreens are not sprouts, that they're grown differently. So microgreens would not be lumped in with those more strict standards for sprouts. So 2019 enforcement's beginning this year. And, the very large farms are going to probably look to potentially be inspected by an FDA auditor. So hopefully the very, very large operations will have all their ducks in a row with all the parts except for the water portion of the produce safety rule. Okay. And also if you sign up for the Produce Safety Alliance, a monthly newsletter in the February 2019 edition, and I can email this to you too because I have this on my computer. They actually have a form that the FDA has submitted to the public that from what I understand, will be the checklist that they would use, or the auditing form that they'd use for their on-farm inspections for produce safety rule and FSMA enforcement. Okay, so if you want to get a copy of that and look and see what that looks like and what specifically they'll be looking for, I encourage you to go to the Produce Safety Alliance website and download that, or I can send that to the group as well, so you can kind of get a feel for what an auditor or an FDA inspector might be looking for. So the other point that I want to clarify, I keep saying FDA or state inspector. In the state of Illinois is one of only 4 states that doesn't have a cooperative agreement with the FDA for enforcement. So the other states that do have cooperative agreements, they actually, the federal government gave the states money to allow their state inspection teams, like on their Department of Agriculture, to do these inspections. So in many states, it'll be the state level inspectors that'll be enforcing FSMA. But unfortunately in Illinois, because we do not have a cooperative agreement with the FDA, it will be the FDA coming in and inspecting farms. Okay. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. But this form that the FDA submitted for these inspections will likely be the form they use if they do come to your farm for one of these inspections. Okay, so the kill step exemption, this is, remember I was discussing the written disclosure to the buyer or the buyer assurance to the farm that they actually are using a validated kill step if you're looking for that commercial processing exemption. So it sounds like in 2019, according to the slide, that it will be at the FDA's discretion in terms of following that paper trail. So you likely would have to still make written disclosure to the buyer that you have not processed that product adequately, but it doesn't sound like buyer assurance back to the grower will be required at least this year. Okay, so if this falls, if you're the type of farm that's only going to be selling to a commercial processor, this would apply to you, and you can contact the Produce Safety Alliance or myself for more details surrounding that. Okay, so that is virtually the end here. This is actually a video. If you just type in virtual farm inspection tour FDA in any search engine, this is actually a 38-minute video kind of giving you an overview of what an inspection would look like for your farm operation. This is actually for a very large produce farm in the Central Valley in California. So it might not apply to your operation, but it'll still kind of give you a feel for what it might look like if an FDA inspector comes to your farm. So I encourage you to check this video out if you want. So with that, we do have a few minutes left. So if you have any questions that you want to type in the chat box, I don't think I saw many typed in the chat box, or mainly I didn't. So if there's any questions you have, we can go ahead and answer those now, and we can take as long as we need. If you need to get off the call, feel free to do so. So I see this first question from Dawn. Do food sales include food you buy for resale and do not grow or produce, like jams? Also, do food sales include food sold for immediate consumption on the farm, like a sandwich? Great question, Don. So I didn't mention this when I was giving that description of food sales, but yes, any food that you buy to resell. So if you don't have potatoes, for instance, for your farm stand, and you buy that from a grower down the street, that resold produce can be considered under the food sales. Now, the question about immediate consumption foods like sandwiches, I'm not 100% sure about that. If those, direct immediate consumption foods would qualify under that food sales rule, but I would operate under the assumption that they would for the time being until I could either clarify that or the FDA clarifies that a little bit more, but I'm pretty sure it would. So any food sales, whether it's processed items or ready to eat foods, like in the case of selling sandwiches, maybe for an agritourism operation, that would be included in that definition as well. Okay, great question. Any other questions while we have everyone on the line here? And I'll just remind everyone that, again, this is new. This is the first year of inspections. I know there's a lot of sort of fear surrounding FSMA and the produce safety rule, but I think, at least based on my experience with gap audits and doing voluntary food safety audits for farms, there is a lot of fear leading up to an inspector or an auditor coming to your operation. But as long as you have a good plan in place, a food safety plan, and good systems in place, then, once you get that first inspection or first audit done, a lot of the tension comes out of preparing for something like this. So, I think it's good business practice and in general to kind of plan food safety around your operation. And it should be something you're doing for the life of your farm and not just kind of preparing for an inspector to come and then you go back to, non-good agricultural practices afterwards. So, I would encourage you to take one of our trainings. And like I said, if you visit the Produce Safety Alliance website and filter via Illinois, you'll be able to see when we have some upcoming trainings near your area. So that takes us to the end of our hour. Again, I can hang on for a few more minutes if there's any questions, burning questions you have related to this. You can go ahead and type in the chat box. Otherwise, you can contact me, and I'll type my email address in here, or most of you have it anyway, because I've been sending you most of the email. So there's my email address. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a question. Otherwise, thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, Zach, thanks for joining us today, Zach. Great presentation, got a lot of good information out of it. Doesn't look like anyone is typing in any questions, so I guess we'll wrap up. And if you have some burning questions, you can email Zach. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar today. We got a lot of good information that will help you in your small farm endeavors. Hopefully, even something you can put in place yet this winter. Please look for an email from Zach with a link to the archived webinar on the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel, as well as a very short evaluation of the webinar you have just watched. We do look at your feedback and use it in shaping our future webinars, so it's very vitally important for us to get these. And with that, have a good rest of the day and a productive growing season in 2019. And join us next week for Maximizing Your Production, Succession and Companion Planting with Lori George.